Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to RBS and NatWest Mentors webinar on the myth of the short service dismissal. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Paul Buck. I'm an employment law business partner for RBS and NatWest Mentor. And before I go through the agenda for this next fun-packed hour, let me first and foremost just go through some brief housekeeping. If anything, if you're like me, you're going to have lots and lots of questions. So throughout the presentations, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A. So if you've got any questions, populate that Q&A chat. If you have a look on the Q&A, it's got a thumb up option. So if you see a question that you like, click the thumb up and that will send it further up the hierarchy. This hour's for you. So just make sure you've got no Amazon deliveries. I'm not expecting any fire alarms to go off. I've had a cup of tea and I've got the next hour scheduled out, but yes, enjoy it. When we come to the end of the presentation, you're going to be asking, can I have a copy of the slide deck? Yes, you can, but there's a small ask, and I'll repeat this at the end. There's a very small Q&A at the end. Just going to ask you for some feedback on the webinar so we can make sure that future webinars are appropriately aimed. And also, it is a very emotive subject, the short service dismissal. At this point, we can't answer any questions or give specific advice to a particular case that you might be dealing with. But again, there's some numbers at the end. So if you feel you're out there on your own or you just want to double check with some advice, then please feel free to give us a call. So let me introduce our guests. So we have on the panelists today, the lovely Lucy Coombs. Those of you who've been on webinars before will notice that Lucy is normally my co-host and we do this together, but she's abandoned me for this one because we thought it appropriate from a business partner perspective, you hear what they have to say. So lots of questions for Lucy today, please. I'll be putting her through her paces. We've got the amazing Paul Ray, who's head of litigation. And those who came on the last webinar will know he's got a vast amount of knowledge. We could sit and listen to them all day. And also, I'm really delighted to say on this occasion, we've got one of our advisors, Caroline Miller. And I'm not embarrassed to say I've phoned Caroline a number of times just for that second opinion. She's one of our most trusted advisors. So enjoy the next hour. We've got some short presentations. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. Keep them questions coming. I'm going to be writing them down. But first and foremost, Mr. Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. So I'll touch base probably a bit for the next 20 minutes or so on the legal context behind the short service dismissal. And I'll go through the theory behind it, some of the pitfalls associated with it, and some misconceptions. If we go to the first slide, please, Paul. So what do I mean when I say short service dismissal? Well, we're talking about the situation whereby an employee has not yet required the statutory 2-year period in order to acquire the right not to be unfairly dismissed. So when I talk about short service dismissal, I'm talking about that first 2-year period of employment. But let's start at the very beginning. And the very beginning is contract law. You get an employee's contract out, and the contract will simply say that the employer can give the employees notice to terminate. As long as the employer gives the employee notice to terminate, the employment can be terminated. And if the contract existed on its own, that is what would happen. And indeed, in some jurisdictions, that is what happens. The contract is basically the be-all and end-all of the contract, but that's not the case in the UK. We have the statutory overlay of the right not to be unfairly dismissed. It's a right that materialised in 1971 and is now enshrined in the Employment Rights Act 1996 under section 94. And put simply, that right is that an employee has a right not to be unfairly dismissed by his employer, but there is a requirement that the employee has 2 years service. Once an employee acquires the right not to be unfairly dismissed, an employer is required to adopt one of the fair reasons, follow a fair process, and the overall dismissal should be within what we call the band of reasonable responses. The fair reasons are on the slide. They are down the side there. They are conduct, capability or qualification, redundancy, statutory restriction, or some other substantial reason being a catch-all provision. Now, the important side to this is the 2-year service requirement. And the 2-year service requirement, we look at the date that the employment contract ended and work back the way. Now, why is the 2-year service requirement important? Well, it's important because it goes to the jurisdiction of the employment tribunal. An employment tribunal simply cannot hear an unfair dismissal case unless the employee meets the qualifying criteria of having the 2-year service. There are some caveats to that because we talk about, generally you'll hear people talking about ordinary unfair dismissal and automatically unfair dismissal, and we'll come to automatically unfair dismissal in a moment. But the rules in relation to ordinary unfair dismissal require that 2-year service period, and therefore it is one of the first questions an employment lawyer will ask a client: how long has the employee been employed? Because it will take us down a different path depending on the answer to that question. We have to be careful though. It's not 2 years as you and I would know it, where the 8th of April would be the 8th of April the following year. The way the law is written is that the 2-year service requirement is met when the employee reaches 2 years minus a day. So we count the 8th of April, for example, 2021, and that employee will acquire the right on the 7th of April 2023, and that arises from a case in Scotland called Pasiti Jones v O'Brien, whereby the employer thought the 8th of April was the relevant day and the employee thought the 7th of April was the relevant day, and the employment tribunal, ultimately employment appeal tribunal, and then the Inner House of the Court of Session eventually held no, it's the 8th of April to the 7th of April, and at that point the employee acquires the right. So employers need to bear that in mind. Another thing an employer should bear in mind is the date on which the contract comes into operation. I say that because of a case, the General of the Salvation Army against Dewsbury. It dates back to 1984, and that's where an employee started on the 1st of May, or the contract came into effect on the 1st of May, which happened to be a Saturday. But it was the bank holiday weekend, so the employee didn't actually present herself for work until the 4th of May. What happens? Well, we end up with the employment relationship coming to an end, and there's an argument about whether the anniversary was on the 1st of May or whether it was on the 4th of May. It ended up with litigation ensuing, and as a result, the outcome of that case was the 1st of May was taken to be the date, because that was the date that the contract came into effect, notwithstanding the fact that the employee didn't actually present herself for work until the 4th of May. That's quite common because it's quite often that an employer might, for administrative purposes, want to put people on payroll at the same time. So beware of the date that the contract comes into operation, which may not be the same date that the employee presents himself for work. The other thing an employer needs to be aware of, and this is very important, is the statutory minimum notice period. So an employee, once they've acquired 1 month's service, will have the right to 1 week's notice period. If an employer dismisses an employee and doesn't give the statutory minimum notice period, the date of dismissal will be extended by the statutory minimum notice period of a week. Not the contractual notice period, that's something different, but the employment tribunal will look at whether the statutory minimum notice period was given, and if not, it will add it on. So we're talking about quite a significant pitfall that a lot of employers find themselves stumbling into. The exception to that is where the employee is guilty of gross misconduct. That allows the employer to terminate the employment immediately. But we have to remember that gross misconduct is quite a high threshold. We're talking about the most serious aspects of misconduct that fundamentally breach the employment contract, and that's quite a high hurdle. So an employee simply not being very good or not fitting in is unlikely to meet that gross misconduct hurdle. So what happens next? Well, if an employee does not have the right not to be unfairly dismissed, where do we go? The employee goes along to the lawyer, they say, I've only got a year's service. And the employer says, oh, well, you really need 2 years service to claim ordinary unfair dismissal. Next slide, please. Well, this is where we end up with, you'll see Lauren there, played by Catherine Tate, unfairly dissed. The employee says, well, I don't have the right not to be unfairly dismissed, but do I have any other rights? And what rights can I bring that will put pressure on the employer, or at least encourage them to settle a claim? So we'll go to the next slide, please. So my encouragement here is to be wary of creative lawyers, because an employment lawyer who's acting for an employee will say, okay, you don't have the right not to be unfairly dismissed. However, there are 70 causes of action available in the Employment Tribunal, over 70. So ordinary unfair dismissal is one cause of action, but it's not the only risk. And as a result, the 2-year service criteria is not of itself a Harry Potter invisibility cloak that will protect an employer. There are a number of claims that an employee can bring in the Employment Tribunal and indeed in the court that mean that an employer need to be aware of that when they're undertaking a short service dismissal. One of the most common types of claim there is breach of contract. So that's where the employee, it's also known as wrongful dismissal, and that's where the employee has been dismissed without being given the period of notice as contained in their employment contract. If an employee hasn't been given the requisite period of notice, they can go down to the Employment Tribunal and present a claim, and the Employment Tribunal will hear that breach of contract claim. So one of the most important things an employer can do when looking at a 2-year service or a short service dismissal is to make sure that if it's dismissing, then it's dismissing with the requisite notice period in accordance with the employment contract and indeed the statutory minimum notice period, and that the employee is aware that the dismissal has taken effect on a particular date. Breach of contract is one, so an employer can get away with or get around that by paying in lieu of notice if the contract provides it, but again, be cautious about gross misconduct because it's quite a high bar, and an employee, again, that's just a square peg in a round hole, for example, that's not fitting in during the first 2 years is unlikely to be in that gross misconduct camp. It's important as well that there are a number of other claims under the Employment Rights Act that are not impacted by the 2-year qualifying period. As I mentioned earlier, these are also known as automatically unfair dismissal or inadmissible reasons. An employer that uses one of these reasons will automatically unfairly dismiss the employee. Now, there's too many to go through today. There are weird and wonderful ones in there, some of which you may never experience it in your career, some of which employment lawyers might not experience. But some of the inadmissible reasons are some of the most common ones I've put on the screen there. So they are protected disclosures or whistleblowing. An employee is not required to have 2-year service in order to bring an unfair dismissal claim if the reason for the dismissal is that they made protected disclosures or they blew the whistle. An employee can automatically claim unfair dismissal if that is one of the employer's reasons. Equally, if the employee complains about health and safety risks, again, the employee is not required to have the 2-year service requirement. So an employee that comes in and says, this building is dangerous, I'm being asked to undertake dangerous activities. If the reason for the dismissal relates to the health and safety, then the employee does not require the 2-year service. The assertion of a statutory right is another common reason that for an employee putting or progressing an unfair dismissal claim. That is, there are a number of rights that are encapsulated in the Employment Rights Act, the Working Time Regulations, the National Minimum Wage Regulations. If an employee says, I want to take my right to annual leave, I want to exercise my right to be represented at a disciplinary or grievance hearing, any of the statutory rights that exist mean that an employee can say if the employer dismisses the employee for asserting that right, or they believe the employee is about to assert that right, then that can be an automatically unfair dismissal reason. Equally, an employer that dismisses an employee for time off, for taking time off for dependents or many of the family-friendly rights, will automatically dismiss the employee because they're not required to have the 2-year service requirement. And equally, many trade union representatives or people undertaking trade union activities or acting as a pension trustee have the right not to be unfairly dismissed for exercising those duties, and as a result, they don't need the 2-year service requirement. So dismissal for breach of contract is a risk. Dismissal for one of the automatically unfair reasons is also a risk. Both of these do not require a 2-year service requirement. And the final one that we see time and time again is discrimination claims. So an employee does not need to have the 2-year service requirement to bring a discrimination claim. Indeed, if we remember, even those that are job applicants are protected under discrimination law, and as a result, you don't need any service requirement necessarily. Indeed, you may not even have been employed yet to be protected by discrimination by the discrimination laws. Reminding ourselves of what are the protected characteristics that are protected under discrimination. We've got age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. So if an employee is dismissed for one of those reasons, having one of those protected characteristics or asserting rights associated with them, then the employee may bring a discrimination claim. And it's quite common to see that where the employee doesn't have the qualifying period for unfair dismissal, they might advance a discrimination claim. And it's not unusual to hear an employer say, well, I don't think the employee has any protected characteristics. They don't have a disability, they're not pregnant, I'm not aware of them being of a particular race or a religion. But one of the things that I would say to that is we have to remember that some of the protected characteristics everyone has. So everyone has an age, everyone has a sex, everyone has a sexual orientation. Many people will be married or parts of civil partnerships. So it's not necessarily as simple as saying the individual doesn't have a disability, for example. There are other grounds that might be brought. The other important thing that it's worth recognising is the ACAS code, which sets out the standards that are expected of employers, and the guide that accompany the code, saying absolutely nothing about the 2-year service requirement. The 2-year service requirement is something that lives in the Employment Rights Act, but employers exercising what is expected of good industrial standards, which is what's encapsulated in the ACAS code. Well, there's nothing in the ACAS code that says that an employee with under 2 years service should be treated any differently. So theoretically, there is an expectation that the ACAS code applies to all employees, not just those employees that are under the 2-year service requirement. And why is that important? Well, the 25% uplift, as set out in Section 207 of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act of 1992, also known as TULRA, provides that if an employment tribunal is awarding compensation for particular claims, it can award a 25% uplift where there is an unreasonable failure by the employer to follow the ACAS code. So when an employer has dismissed without following any form of process, there is a risk that any compensation that is awarded is uplifted by up to 25% as well. Going on to the next slide, please, Paul. So that's just so that you can see what they look like. There's the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act. The second picture there is the ACAS Code of Practice, which sets out the minimum standards that are expected of employees. And then the ACAS Guide supplements the middle, the ACAS Code, and that's full of more detailed expectations is what is expected by an employer following good industrial relations practice. So just bearing in mind that an employment tribunal may uplift an award if there is an unreasonable failure to comply with the ACAS code. Moving to the next slide, please, Paul. So what does the ACAS code say? Well, first of all, the ACAS code of practice is a minimum standard that is expected of employers. Employers may embellish on it, they may create bigger, wider processes, but it sets out the minimum standards. The code and the guide are effectively saying that employers should follow a full and fair procedure in line with the ACAS code when it's dealing with discipline and grievance cases. And the procedure that an employer will follow will be considered by an employment tribunal. So an employer that's got some form of procedure under its belt when it faces any form of claim is in a better position where there is no process being followed. And the code also then goes on to say, or the guide, that a failure to follow the code of itself doesn't mean that somebody is liable to proceedings, but again, an employment tribunal will have regard to failure to conform to the code when deciding on relevant cases. What are the basics of a fair procedure? Well, understanding the options, following a fair procedure that's allowing the employee the right to be accompanied, carrying out such investigation as is necessary in the circumstances, undertaking a hearing where the employee gets the opportunity to tell you what the problem is, if it's a grievance, or the employer gets the opportunity to put the disciplinary case to the employee before it makes a decision. Coming to a decision that is within the band of reasonable responses, that is the kind of decision that a fair employer would come to in the circumstances and doesn't go beyond what a fair employer would do. And step 6 is usually after the procedure. It tends to be good practice to give the employee the opportunity to appeal. So that sets out the basics of the law. We're recognising the main point that an employee with short service under 2 years doesn't have the right not to bring ordinary unfair dismissal claims, but that doesn't mean, again, that the employer is completely protected. There are other claims that can be brought by the employee in the employment tribunal, and frequently creative lawyers, when they realise the employee doesn't have the right not to be unfairly dismissed, start to advance those reasons. And as a result, we see litigation ensuing, notwithstanding the fact that the employee doesn't have the 2-year service. I'm now going to hand over to Lucy, who's going to talk about some of the practical considerations that go beyond the law. Lucy, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Absolutely brilliant, as always. You've really highlighted for us. Exiting someone from employment is a significant action for an employer to take in all circumstances, even where someone might only have been with us for a very short period of time. And that's the key myth that we really wanted to explore with you today with this webinar. So we support clients every day with managing these sort of situations, and we recognise there are always going to be situations where it is absolutely the right decision for the business to effect dismissals. And that's what I want to help you with today. I really want to help you with ensuring that you, your managers, your business can manage confidently and effectively when faced with these circumstances. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, and that is never more true than when faced with difficult employee scenarios. So I've pulled together some further tips to share, or some further myths that we're going to bust, that I want all our clients, all our businesses, all managers to know ahead of dismissing someone. And in fact, prior to the point that they take responsibility for managing a team. If we can move on to the first slide, please, Paul. So there we go. We've established dismissal is a significant action to take. That's hopefully not in question for anybody. Next key message I'd like to give to all managers is that short service dismissal should not be considered an easy option or carried out without due consideration and planning. I know Paul's already very eloquently brought this to life for us. I just can't emphasize this enough. Please take advice prior to taking action, and as early as possible. Please don't fall into the trap of thinking it's okay, we can just let them go because they have less than 2 years service. Neither businesses nor managers should be managing their teams using this. Paul's already highlighted for us, it isn't automatically safe or necessarily low risk, and it certainly isn't an easy option. Rest assured, we can help you, and you can help yourselves to get the right outcome and make the best commercial decisions. It's like everything in life, right? It needs to be done well and from a position of full information, understanding, and consideration. The most upsetting situation for me in my job is when an employee has, for whatever reason, been in the wrong, but through addressing that and deciding to dismiss, but without doing it and without that due consideration and without that being in that position of full knowledge, the employer ends up placing themselves in the wrong. And that's what we want to avoid. That's how we can be most commercial. And I'm not just talking here about potential legal claims or complications. Yes, of course, we're here to protect our clients. And we do that by evidencing the fair processes that have been followed and the reasonable decisions taken in the circumstances. But it is much more than just having that defensible position should we face legal challenge. So my next key message for managers is get ahead of the game. Actively and proactively manage your staff. I want to give you that benefit of hindsight to make sure that you're taking those practical actions to hopefully, perhaps, prevent the need for short service dismissals to even take place as far as possible. Because let's face it, this is not a situation anyone particularly wants to be in. We know that attracting, recruiting, onboarding and retaining staff is costly and time intensive. Plus, we're facing a current climate where the staff we want to employ that are good caliber, high quality, with the right skill sets, who demonstrate a strong work ethic, with attitudes and behaviours that align with our ideas of model employees, and who want to work with us. Well, I'm afraid to say they're just not growing on trees at the moment. They're in pretty short supply, to be honest. So from that robust business resilience perspective, we should be challenging, why are we needing to make an early dismissal decision? Could it have been avoided? We may not always get recruitment right. There may be issues that need to be addressed. Some people will be bad at points, and that's through no fault of the organisation. And I'm sure we've all experienced that at one time or another, and you're all probably sat there right now going, I promise, Lucy, I tried everything. Yes, the right decision in those circumstances may well be to exit someone sooner rather than later, where there are objective and robust business grounds for doing so. I'm just going to bring in here one of the questions that we've been asked, which was, can the contract be more than 1 week's notice as standard? And absolutely, yes, it can. You can contract whatever you like within reason, provided it's not illegal or below minimum standards. But I would just bring in at this point, please beware extended notice periods at the recruitment stage. Just give consideration to, what if this goes wrong? Are we happy to stand by whatever we're writing into our contract? As Paul said, gross misconduct is a high bar, and that's the only way to get around not paying someone their contractual notice. And that includes where someone has less than 2 years service. And there will be heavy scrutiny if it's considered that decision to dismiss gross misconduct is to get around paying a contractual notice period. So I just wanted to bring in, there's always a critical balance to be navigated. You neither want to be too soft, nor do you want to be painted as cruel and heartless. Please be mindful, the case that's presented at a tribunal, or to family, or to friends, or to the press, or to other colleagues, or on social media, it will bear very little resemblance to the situation you feel you're managing. So when we're considering short service dismissals, I do always sort of encourage clients, to do a certain amount of reflection, perhaps a little bit of soul searching. And some things I would absolutely recommend you consider. Was the job sold correctly in the first place? Have the role requirements been clearly defined and therefore articulated? And are the expectations and the perceptions from both sides fully aligned? Another common failing may be not following a robust recruitment process. And that could absolutely include having question marks over the initial appointment for a number of reasons. I absolutely recognise we are time poor and we may rush a recruitment even if there are flags, or possibly without carrying out sufficient due diligence. And again, this is where we may hear from managers that it's okay, we'll trial them, we'll let them go during probation if it doesn't work out. This really should not be used as a shortcut for thorough and sensible assessment and checking as part of recruitment and part of that pre-employment process. We should absolutely be balancing the consideration that it's better to have an empty house than a bad tenant. Like I said, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but really do check those things out first before you commit to opening your door for the first time to someone you do not know. And another point I would also recommend you consider, inducting someone well right from the start. I've worked with a number of clients recently who've gone through 2 or 3 iterations within less than a year of appointing and training a new team member for them to not work out. And outside of the short service dismissal itself, which we've inevitably been able to support with, so that's not the issue, it's the wider impact on colleagues and on the business and on the future plans that are all significant. So we've seen, huge frustration at the waste of time. We've seen evident decrease in morale and engagement. We've seen negative cycles of behaviours. For example, an expectation demonstrated by people, wider across the team, that this one isn't going to work out before we've even started the process. We've seen manifestations of dissatisfaction, which in some cases has resulted in grievances. We've seen issues being raised that flexible working requests aren't being supported because the promised recruitment that would enable those hasn't come through. We've seen concerns over stress. We've seen relationships between colleagues breaking down. We've seen performance issues being raised, and we've seen succession plans and business objectives just not being achieved. So that just brings me on to my next key message for managers. How you treat people impacts on everyone. It shapes culture. The number of times we're asked how to change culture, and one of those ways is absolutely through our actions and our interactions with our key stakeholders, our employees, every single day. The way we behave and the way we are perceived to behave. And this absolutely includes managing performance, managing behaviours, responding to business changes, all of these things irrespective of length of service. Other colleagues are not necessarily going to say, oh, that was okay, they had less than 2 years service. They're just not going to make that distinction. They are, however, perhaps going to think, wow, if they're going to do that to so-and-so, what's to stop them doing that to me? So controlling that message and communicating with the wider team is as critical a part of the process as everything you're going through with the individual. Let's remember, you're about to take away someone's ability to pay their mortgage. And I think we said this right at the start, dismissal is a highly emotive action. The impact can be compared with a bereavement. If people don't feel they've been fairly treated, if they feel aggrieved at not being heard or at not being given a fair hearing, if their employer won't listen to them, then the only people that are going to listen to them are their friends, their family, and the employment tribunal. The only way they feel they can get justice will be to raise a claim. So having that dialogue, holding that meeting, being able to clearly explain the reasons are useful, and not just from a claim perspective. It also helps protect your reputation. So if you've given warning shots, if you've signposted with examples and feedback when things have gone wrong or there have been red flags, this will all help with the conversation if you ultimately need to exit someone. And it's fair to let someone know there are issues and to give them a chance to improve. Often, those that are given that robust feedback can actually turn into being our greatest superstar employees in the future. So all of these actions feed into the psychological contract. And if we start to think about what that looks like and what we want from that social contract, employees want to contract with a business that is going to conduct itself fairly. The law provides a minimum, but employers may want to conduct themselves above that bare minimum, rather perhaps than adopting a model where people just, disappear overnight. So if we can just hop on to the next slide, please, Paul, just so I can quickly summarise the key takeaways for managers. That first one, having a sensible process in place can really help us identify and perhaps more importantly, articulate the issue. And that can help with understanding what has gone wrong and really help us to get to that root cause. If there is any feedback, any learning or any potential for improvement in the future, then we can absolutely take that on board, get that benefit of hindsight. And then finally, managing the perception, the reputation and the culture. That really helps you to communicate the right messages to other staff and demonstrate that you manage people well in all circumstances. You know, you put doing the right thing first, even when there are difficult circumstances, difficult decisions to be made. So on to our last slide, please, Paul, before we hand over to the Q&A. I really just want to highlight here, the dismissal should not be coming as a surprise. Onboarding and induction through to month 1, mid and end of probationary reviews, and into ongoing one-to-ones and performance reviews. These should all be giving feedback at key points. And that feedback should absolutely include what is and isn't acceptable behaviour, what are the requirements of the role, and what are the responsibilities and key accountabilities? What do these actually look like in the day-to-day delivery of the role? And how do these translate into actions, behaviours and outcomes? How does performance rate against these measures? Does their perception match with your perception? And this is why we need feedback from all areas, not just our own perception. How are they actually doing? And what's your evidence to back that up? Thank you, Paul. I'll hand over to you now for the Q&A.
Lucy, amazing. Paul, fantastic. I've got loads of questions. Lucy, don't ever leave me on my own again. I've had them coming in over text message, email, the Q&A chat. So I was like, oh my goodness me. We've got lots of questions and we will try our best to work our way through these. Can I be really cheeky though? For the very first question, I'd like to just hand over to Carol-Anne. As I mentioned earlier, Carol-Anne's one of our amazing advisors. But Carol-Anne, short service dismissal, is this a popular thing in the advice service? Do you get lots of calls about this?
Yeah, we do, Paul. It's a really popular topic. And as you know, there's various ways to make contact with advice. You can do it by calling, appointments, or digitally. And about 1 in 5 contacts, so about 20%, is in relation to short service dismissal. So yeah, really popular topic on advice.
Okay. I'd like to go over to the Q&A chat. There's one in here, Lucy. I think this one is best for you. If an employee is promoted to a new role within a new contract, but doesn't perform appropriately, can we just do a short service dismissal?
Thank you, Paul. That's a great question. Remember, continuity of service will apply here. So we're looking at their length of service here. And we can only ever consider a short service dismissal if they have that under 2-year service, as Paul shared with us. But it's a great question, because what we need to be doing is we need to be future-proofing this. So when you make those promotions, absolutely just think ahead to the scenario of, what if this goes wrong? I don't want to be overly negative about it. Obviously, we want to be positive. We want to be optimistic. We want to put in place everything we can to ensure success. But equally, we need to be realistic and we need to think carefully about what steps will we take if it doesn't work out. Is there going to be an option to perhaps trial the promotion? Is it going to be reasonable to put them back into previous role, or is that not going to be an option? If they don't work out and there are performance issues, we will have to manage that as a performance situation through a full process.
Super comprehensive. Thank you, Lucy. Paul, this
You're
one
welcome.
Definitely feels like it's in your ballpark. If a limited company decides to go into liquidation, do all responsibilities simply go out the window?
Interesting one. An employer that goes into liquidation or effectively closes its doors is in a different position. The reality is the redundancy payment, etc., will be made by the redundancy service, who are set up basically through the National Insurance Fund for contributions to be made. Liquidators effectively may come in and immediately dismiss the employees unfairly, and that still means that the employee can raise a claim for unfair dismissal. It will be against the company in liquidation, and the employees then would be become creditors and will rank with other creditors in the normal course of ranking. So an employer that simply closes its door because it's gone bust does not escape unfair dismissal or redundancy payment. But in effect, the employees then become creditors. And there's slight different provisions as well if they go into administration. And it's not unusual. We do see instances of an employer that simply goes bust overnight. And whilst theoretically the employer should follow a process, practically there is no business there anymore. And as a result, keeping the employees on is something the liquidators don't want to do because they're still incurring liability for every day. So it may be that the dismissal is unfair because there's no process followed, but we also do need to remember a case of pokey, whereby an employment tribunal in an unfair dismissal claim will look at what would have happened if a fair process was followed, and if a business has closed its door because it's no longer going to trade, then the likelihood is that if a fair process had followed, it would still end up with the same result. So any unfair dismissal could be reduced by 100% because it's likely that the dismissal would have taken place even if a fair process had been followed. But good question. Main thing, take advice early. If the business is in financial difficulty, then you want to consider the impact of employees, but those employees are likely to raise a claim for unfair dismissal, but equally notice pay and the redundancy payment, and the National Insurance Fund will effectively meet the redundancy payment side of things.
Sure. Fantastic. Amazing. Caroline, if I can move over to you, because I think this is a great one. AWOL. So the employee's gone AWOL, they've called them, they've wrote to them, but they're just failing to communicate. Well, what can we do with them?
Well, yeah, always take advice, because first of all, we'd need to identify if there's any risks involved. But essentially, you know, if you can demonstrate that you've tried everything possible, you know, you've tried to contact, you've written to them, you've telephoned them, you know, in some cases you might be really concerned about, you know, the employee, and you contact them next of kin. But if you're able to demonstrate that you've tried everything possible, and they've got less than 2 years service, then yeah, you know, potentially you can dismiss. We would always, you know, ask that you can demonstrate that you've tried everything possible. But yeah, you know, it would be possible, you know, to dismiss. However, you know, always take advice, because specific situations, and, you know, we need to try and determine the risks involved. But yeah, potentially, you know, if you can demonstrate you've tried everything possible to make contact.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. Lucy, I'm going to hand this one over to you. This is all about organisation design. We've got staff members less than 2 years service, but we are looking at downsizing. Can we just use the last in, first out short service dismissal to get ourselves out of this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a, you know, it's a fair reason potentially, and you know, could absolutely support your business needs at that time. You know, obviously someone with less than 2 years is not going to be entitled to redundancy payment. So it's potentially a less expensive dismissal to effect for you. And it may be perceived to be fairer on other staff who have longer service, that you've not brought someone in and then they're losing their job as a consequence. For me, it is about, you know, you are dismissing on the grounds of redundancy. You know, that is the reason for the dismissal. The process you follow could effectively be a short service dismissal process. I would still have my business case clearly set out as to this is the reason for the dismissal, and I'd be going through that with the individual in a conversation and explaining that to them. But yeah, I would absolutely use that. It's a fairly blunt instrument to use length of service, but it's held to be fair.
Yeah.
One development on that, Paul, and we see this in cases where an employer uses LIFO, is it's not uncommon for an age discrimination claim to be raised by the employee. So they don't have the right not to be unfairly dismissed, but they might say, I've been selected for redundancy because I'm the youngest member of the team. I don't have the same service as everyone else. You know, I'm a school leaver. I've just come out of college. I've not been here very long, and I think my age has been a factor that has allowed you to dismiss me. I'm not saying the age is a factor or not, but the employee presents the claim and the employer has to answer the claim. So whether or not age was a factor or not, it's really irrelevant. The employee has said, I think age was a factor, and the employer is going to have to respond to that claim to say it's not. So we still find ourselves in litigation arguing about whether age was a factor or not. Just a caveat on the last in, first out. When you use it, does run the risk of being of seeing an age discrimination claim come in.
Perfect. Caroline, the question that you asked earlier, we've got more questions that just spin out from it. Either that or people just prefer listening to you. I don't.
I'm sure
the question was, somebody's gone AWOL, we've wrote to them, we've called them, they're just not answering, and we'll give you some advice. The next question that's bolted onto that is, can we not just assume resignation rather than dismissal for AWOL?
Again, it's one that we need to tread carefully with, and we would assess the risks of that. So, perhaps someone's been off with a health condition and then they've gone AWOL. There could be many reasons for the fact that they're not making contact. So I think, we would always assess the risks. If it's a very short-serving employee, and there's no risks identified, they've only been with you for a couple of weeks, you kind of know they're not happy in the job, they've got friends, and they've said they're not coming back, and there's no risks, or it's low risk, then potentially, yeah, you could assume resignation. But, each case is individual, and sometimes it's better to follow the AWOL process, and have the evidence that you've tried to make contact, as I said before, if you were challenged. But on occasions, yeah, it could be an option to use.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, Caroline. I think it's a good myth to bust here that, an assumed resignation is going to be no safer or afford you any more protection than following a short service dismissal process. They're both going to be subject to the same potential claims, but absolutely, it might be the best outcome to follow it as an assumed resignation, but we'd still be writing to them say, look, we've tried to get hold of you, we haven't heard from you, you've not shown up for work, we're assuming you've resigned, but if that isn't the case, please get in touch with us as soon as possible. The end result is still the same. We're still evidencing that we've done everything we can to get in touch and sort this out.
Okay, I'm going to canter on because we've got loads of questions. Paul Ray, a very quick one for you. How do I know if somebody's raised a claim against me?
I don't know how quick that'll be. So what will happen is, in the first instance, an employee is required to contact ACAS. So for 99% of claims, the employee needs to contact ACAS and engage the early conciliation process. This is a process that has been designed to try and get the parties to settle any disputes before it gets into the door of the employment tribunal. So ACAS will attempt to make contact with the employer, either by telephone or by email, using contact details provided by the employee. They'll get in touch with the employer and they'll say, are you interested in this claim being conciliated? ACAS have a statutory duty to try and conciliate, and the conciliation period is up to 6 weeks. However, if an employee says, no, I don't want to conciliate, or an employer says, I don't want to conciliate, then ACAS will give the employee a conciliation number, and the employee then can go and present a claim to the employment tribunal. Claims are presented to the employment tribunal online, or you fill out an online form. It's a very straightforward process to do, and the employment tribunal will then send that claim form, known as the ET1, to the employer. Two different documents will apply, and they're usually sent by post. There's the ET1, there's the ET2, which tells the employer that a claim has been raised against them, and that tells them the date how long they've got to respond to that claim. It's 28 days. Now that's not long, because if you consider 28 days, we're talking 20 working days, 4 weeks to get your house in order and get your responses in. So there's the ET2 that sets out the date, and the ET3 is the document that the employer fills out, which basically the employer tells its story, what happened. And again, there's 28 days for that to be submitted, so not long. I would say if an employer gets an ET1 landing on its doorstep, do not ignore it. It means a claim has been raised against you, and you've only got 28 days to respond. And if you don't respond, an employment judge may just make a decision based on the ET1 and the papers before them, which could be a decision against you. So I would encourage employers to very quickly take advice if you get an ET1 landing on your doorstep. But the main process, early conciliation, ET1 goes to the employer through the post, and the employer needs to send the ET3 back, and thereafter it may be a hearing date is immediately set, or the case goes forward for case management. Perfect.
Amazing. Thank you. Lucy, this one feels like a workplace culture one, but let me read the question, because there's a phrase I'm going to steal forever. Would it be appropriate to dismiss an employee within 2 years if the reason is their negative impact on the workplace and result in alienation of colleagues to the point where valuable staff are threatening to leave, aka the energy vampires?
Yes, I love that phrase too. Absolutely appropriate to dismiss. I mean, this is behaviors, right? You know, absolutely something that we should be managing. You know, appropriate behaviors are just as important as skill sets and capabilities. So again, we just need to be able to evidence that the behavior is inappropriate, and that we're not acting in any discriminatory fashion. Sounds like it would be very easy to evidence that one. You'd have a whole host of examples you'd be able to give to manage and discuss that and signpost that and demonstrate that as being your reason for dismissal.
Perfect. Caroline, if someone was employed for 5 years, they left for a year, then returned, would any of their previous service be considered, or would it be looked at from a perspective of a new contract date?
So there's a significant break in service to be able to say that it's a new contract. To break service currently is 1 week spanning 2 weekends, but you would always check that, you know, it had been the employment had been ended appropriately, you know, on payroll, P45 issued, any outstanding holidays paid. But yeah, that's a significant gap to break service, so it would be under a new contract.
Okay. And sorry, Caroline, to stay with you, you know I love our advisors. When you've made a short service dismissal and paying them for the notice period, say payments in lieu for a 2-month period, do we need to issue P45 at the end of the employment, i.e. after the 2-month payroll, or the end of the month when the employment was terminated? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you would issue the P45 after the employment's terminated. So if they're paying in lieu of notice, then the employment is terminated then. If they're working their notice or they're on garden leave, then the employment ends at the end of the notice period. So yeah, you would issue that once the employment has ended, depending on whether you're paying in lieu of notice or in garden leave or they're working their notice.
Okay, got a few more minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze some of these in. Paul Ray, any idea what the usual size of a payout is? Is it linked to salary, length of service, notice, etc.?
Yeah, that if an employee is unfairly dismissed, then normally what they're going to get is their actual losses from the date that they are dismissed from employment unfairly until they get a new job at a comparable salary. So it's the actual losses that the employee's going to recover. It is capped at about £105,000 as a maximum, or 52 weeks pay. So the maximum award for unfair dismissal is going to be a year's pay, or the statutory upper limit, it's not usually a year's pay because most employees are able to get a job fairly quickly. Indeed, I've seen cases whereby an employee gets a better paid job and as a result is in a better position after they've been unfairly dismissed than otherwise. The other thing I would caveat there as well is that discrimination claims are uncapped, and they include an element of injury to feeling, and injury to feeling is not available for breach of contract or for unfair dismissal generally. So discrimination claims have that extra element where you could be having quite significant damages awards for not just the loss, but also for the injury to feeling that's suffered as a result of that. So it's based on the employee and how much loss they've got. So an employee on minimum wage is going to have a lower loss than somebody that's on £50,000 a year, but we're looking at the individual circumstances of the employee's loss. So therefore it's difficult to give a guide because we need to look at the circumstances of the employment before we can properly assess the risk to the employer, and sometimes that'll help us inform the strategy as to how we try and negotiate the claim.
Brilliant, fantastic. Lucy, if I may come over to you, because I think you'll probably get this query on a weekly basis, but I'll read the question verbatim. If you're dismissing someone with an extended probation period, extended due to performance concerns, do they still have the right to be warned of this and the opportunity to invite someone to join them for a meeting around this, assuming that it's not the end of the agreement, extended period, but there is enough evidence that the person cannot deliver the role?
So we don't have to follow that full process. However, I see no reason why we wouldn't allow someone to be accompanied if they wish to. I think it's a fair way to treat someone. We've got sufficient evidence. Giving someone notice of a meeting is courteous. So I would potentially do that. But technically, yeah, we could simply bring them in, take them through the concerns that we have and set out, what it is that they are not performing well. And presumably because it's an extended probation period, we're building on a previous conversation. So it's unlikely to be coming as a surprise, as we've said. And provided nothing is thrown up that we didn't know about and causes us to consider there's any further risk, then yeah, we could be confirming the decision to dismiss and confirming that in writing. That would be the short service dismissal process we could follow in those circumstances.
Amazing. Caroline, I know you'll get these questions on a daily basis. If a person with negative behaviour contract behaviour with the defence of ADHD, how would you deal with that? So if the behaviour is a manifestation of the ADHD, how do we cope with that?
Yeah, so, potentially they've got a health condition that could be deemed to be a disability, and their behaviour or their conduct could be arising, as a result of that. So we would obviously need to explore in more detail, have regular discussions with them about their behaviour, about their health, to, just try and determine if, it is having an impact on their behaviour. If an employee is deemed to have a disability, and we try to get as much information as possible, and perhaps contact the GP if they give consent. But if an employee is deemed to have a disability, then as an employer, you are required to consider and make all reasonable adjustments. So we'd certainly need to do that, consider, make all reasonable adjustments, give as much support as possible, try and identify, if there's any kind of trigger points that might be relating to their behaviour. But yeah, ultimately it is one where, we would need to follow perhaps a formal process, and, it would be a risk to, just treat this as a short service dismissal, and it may be, we would advise to follow a formal process and be able to demonstrate that you considered and made all reasonable adjustments and put them in place at a reasonable time before you would even consider dismissal.
Perfect. Lucy, Caroline, Paul Ray, thank you so much. It's been busy. Lucy, don't leave me on my own again. It's been really busy. I've put the slide up, so if you've got any questions, you can contact us. There'll be a short question and answer at the end of this if you want a copy of the slide deck. But again, thank you very much for joining us. All the best for the rest of your day. Take care, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, bye.